Good evening, everybody. I'm supposed to stand here. First of all, I'm very glad to have been invited to give this lecture, and I'm standing in rather August environment with the shadows of the greats of my profession. And I'm very excited to give this lecture, and I hope I can convey to you some of the excitement of our work on the Philistines and the major changes that the field is going through in the last few years. And as you can see, one of the things that we try to do when we're excavating is have a lot of fun. Okay. Now, let's start with the basic question. Who are the Philistines? Well, the main source that for knowledge about the Philistines for many years was the biblical text, and of course, if you read the biblical text, particularly in the period before the Israelite monarchy and the earlier stages of the Israelite monarchy, the Philistines play a major role. And of course, they're well known, for example, the story of Samson and Delilah, David and Goliath, and other examples. And mostly when we think about the Philistines, we think of them as the arch enemies of Israel. For about last century, a little more, archaeological excavations in the southern coastal plain of Israel, what we would call in biblical geography Philistia, have uncovered a lot of evidence about the Philistines. And for quite a long time, based on reading the biblical text, based on the reading of Egyptian sources, which we'll talk about a little later on, and the archaeological evidence, there's been a rather monolithic understanding of what went on with the Philistines, that they came as a unified group from somewhere. We'll talk about this somewhere in a moment. And they landed in Canaan, in the land of Israel, took over an area, and lived there for 600 years, and at some stage assimilated and disappeared. And that's more or less the story that has been told for many years in both the research and in the popular discussions of the Philistines. And the truth is, it's time for a paradigm shift. And the reason why we should have to start talking about this is that over the last few decades, and in particular over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of new finds, a lot of new interpretive directions, and a reassessment of a lot of long-held assumptions. And this evening, I'm going to try to talk to you about some of these finds, some of these new interpretations, some of the new methods we're using, and how this affects our understanding of the Philistines, and through that also our understanding of their relations with the Israelites, the Judites, and the Israelites and Judites in general. And I'll be basing it mainly on the finds from Tel Safigat, but every once in a while I'll mention another less important site. Now, so let's give a little background on the Philistines. Just after 1200 BCE, what we would call in archaeological terms the end of the Late Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age, a lot goes on. And basically what happens is the world order, as was known for about 500 years, or 400 years, in the Eastern Mediterranean, where there were big empires, such as in Egypt, such as in the Hittite Empire in modern-day Turkey, in Babylon, in Assyria, the city-states in the area of Canaan, Syria, Israel, and Lebanon, the very, very important cultures in ancient Greece, the Mycenaean culture. All this basically, over a period of about a century, comes apart. And empires fall, city-states are destroyed, peoples move, and the picture changes very drastically. And I always like using this an analogy is, I don't know if Gil will agree with me, but I look at myself as I'm a time traveler. And if we would go into the time tunnel and come out at 1300 BCE, look around, go back into the time tunnel and come out again at 1100 BCE, everything would have been changed. And it's those 150, 200 years which are a fascinating period in history, And by the way, there's an excellent book, and I don't get any percentage on it. It's being sold outside 1187 BCE on exactly this this process. And this is where the Philistines appear, at this cusp of the collapse of the late Bronze Age civilization. And one of the first and foremost pieces of evidence that we have, which is an Oriental Institute excavation, is the excavations of the mortuary temple of Ramses III, the king of Egypt, who ruled in Egypt in the beginning of the 12th century BCE. And in this mortuary temple, on the walls, there's various depictions of things that either actually happened or Ramses III wanted us to believe happened. And among other things, there's a depiction of a land and a sea battle. That's the land battle and that's the sea battle between the Egyptians and groups which are commonly called the Sea Peoples. And among the Sea Peoples, there's one of the groups are the Philistines. And in this depiction, and if we can understand what's going on, there are peoples who are coming from outside of the Levant and settling and trying to capture areas under Egyptian control, and eventually, based on other Egyptian texts, are settled down in the southern Levant, somewhere modern-day Israel. And for many years, this has been the iconic explanation. Groups who came from somewhere in a unified military campaign and forcefully settled down somewhere in ancient Canaan. And while this is still there, and we can't deny this, we have to look at this, and we'll see this soon, in a very different manner. And when we look at where these people are coming from, so most often, Mycenaean Greece is seen as the region from which the Philistines came from. Once in a while, somebody will say, maybe they came from from Western Anatolia, and then you'll have somebody say, no, they came from Cilicia, and then there's another person say, no, they all came from Cyprus, and then once in a while somebody will go, actually maybe they came from the Balkans. And for years, people have been looking for the Ur Heimat, the Alt Philistia, the original home of the Philistines, and hoping that one day we'll be able to identify where these people came from. And I'll give you a hint of where we're going. It probably is that they came from many places and not from one place. And so when we look at the Philistines and their cultural backgrounds, we have to take into account a region, maybe going back to Sardinia, of very mixed cultural origins and various groups coming together and settling along the southern coastal plain of modern-day Israel. Now, here's where archaeology of Levant comes in. When we start looking at the area of the southern coastal plain, or as we said, Philistia, and in sites which are occupied during the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age, we can see very clearly a distinct change in the material culture. We can see that somewhere right after 1200 BCE, new pottery types appear. And these pottery types are very similar to pottery that we see at the same time in Greece, in the Mycenaean culture, or in Cyprus, or in southern or western Turkey. We see new types of architecture that appears, which is very reminiscent of architecture we see in these western areas. We see new types of cooking apparatus. For example, one of the things that we'll talk about this soon is that the Philistines cook in a round fireplace, or it's not a fireplace, you would call it a campfire or something of the sort, and a hearth. And these are things that we didn't see in Canaan beforehand. So this clearly indicates that something new is going on. And when we fit this in with the Egyptian evidence, the biblical evidence, this fits in very well with our picture of the Philistines as this group coming from outside the country, settling down, carving a region of the southern coastal plain, Philistia, and settling just opposite this very noisy group that was settled just at the same time in the highlands, the Israelites. Because just after 1200, This is when we have the very early first evidence of the formation of the Israelite tribes in the region, which we would call today the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, call it whatever you want to, or the Central Hills in a less politicized geographical jargon. And they sit right opposite the Philistines. And when you look at the map, what you basically have is the Philistines over here, the Israelites over here, and when they're strong, they push eastwards, and when they're strong, they push westwards, and there's this back and forth seesaw between the two groups throughout the Iron Age. And this is reflected in the biblical text as well, and we'll talk about this soon. And it's clearly fits in with why the Philistines play a role in the biblical text. Because the people who wrote the biblical text, their roots are here. If the people who wrote the biblical text were over here, we would have heard about another group of sea peoples. The fact that we're hearing about the sea peoples is because they were facing the Israelites during the Iron Age. Now, as I said, usually it was thought the Philistines were from the Mycenaean culture. They arrive in Canaan and conquer the Canaanite cities in Philistia on the southern coastal plain and replace the Canaanites. And subsequently, there's a slow process of acculturation, assimilation with neighboring cultures. So after 500, 600 years, if you go to Philistia, they've lost their foreignness. They've become Levantanized completely. And another important point is, based on the biblical text, according to the biblical text, from about the 10th century, the time of the so-called United Kingdom, the time of David and Solomon, the Israelite kingdom and subsequently the Judite kingdom are stronger than the Philistines. And according to the biblical text, David captures Philistia and takes over Philistia. But as we'll see, that's far from the case when we start looking at the evidence. So now let's start looking at Tel Gat. Here we have the southern coastal plain, Philistia, with the 5 major cities of the Philistines: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Gat over here. And you can see here Tel Essafi, which is located just on the border between the coastal plain and the foothills, the Judean foothills, which we call in Hebrew the Shphelah. And the Shphelah is the border zone between the coastal plain and the central hills. And most of the biblical texts that deal with the interaction between the Philistines and the Israelites occur in this Shphelah zone. Why? Because it's an interaction zone, and that's where they meet. Now, if you go to the biblical text and count the number of times the various Philistine cities are mentioned, Gat is mentioned more than all the others. And believe me, I counted. And the reason for this, most probably, is that Gat is the closest of the Philistine cities to the Shphelah and to the Judean zones. So probably a lot of the interaction between the Israelites and the Philistines, at least in the earlier part of the Iron Age, occurred at this site, and this is perhaps reflected in the biblical text as well. Now, let's look at a quick view. Here you can see a view from east to west towards the coast, Ashkelon and Gaza. That's the northern Sinai. That's the area of let's say, El Arish nowadays, the border between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. And here you can see the coastal plain Philistia with Gat right on the border with the beginning of the Judean Shphelah, the Judean foothills leading westwards. And this is the Elah Valley, and for those of you familiar with the biblical text, the story of David and Goliath, of course, occurs somewhere between Socho, which is located over here, and Azekah, which is located over here, and somewhere over here, at least according to the biblical text, that's where this battle occurred. And when David knocked off Goliath's head,